Hello, and welcome to our podcast on types of borrowing. In this fairly short podcast, we'll be discussing why people borrow money, what exactly one receives when borrowing, as well as some important vocabulary you, as a consumer, need to know before borrowing any money from a creditor. We'll also ask you to perform some relatively routine calculations so you can see firsthand how the power of interest may impact you as a borrower. So, let's go ahead and get started. First, we need to ask ourselves, why do the large majority of us in our economy need to borrow money? In order to answer this question, we first need to agree that items such as cars, houses, and an education are expensive and only going to be getting more expensive over time. That being said, we also need to agree that most of us do not have millions and millions of dollars just sitting around or stuffed in our mattresses. Because these are what we call big ticket items that we cannot just save for, we need to borrow money in order to obtain them. So, what exactly does one get when they do borrow? First, one is receiving credit, which is good because that allows you, as a consumer, the ability to obtain goods and services. Second, you're also creating debt. For our purposes, let's define this as something, usually money, that is owed or due. So, do I only have to pay back what I borrow? That would be nice, right? However, in our economy, the principle of profit motive once again is at play. So creditors will require you pay the borrowed amount back plus interest. What then is interest? Interest is defined as the money you pay to borrow money. Since nothing is free and creditors are in business to stay in business, they are driven by the ability to make a profit on their consumers. In terms of interest rates, or the percentage of money one must repay to their creditor, the general rule of thumb is the lower the better. In other words, if I need to borrow $100 and one bank is going to charge me 3% or $3 to do so, while another bank is going to charge me, say, 4.25% or $4.25, then it makes the most sense for me to go with the first bank, as I will have to repay less than the second bank. In order to calculate the amount of interest one must repay, we have a fairly easy and basic formula that you'll need to memorize, which is interest equals principal times interest rate times time. So let's break a couple of these things down. Principal, let's start there. Principal is the original amount of money that you borrow from the creditor. Interest rate is expressed as a decimal number, so we'll have to go through the process of changing percentages into decimal numbers. And then time is the number of years. So in order to do that, you'll first need to multiply the interest rate by the amount that you borrowed, otherwise known as the principal. Then you'll take that amount and multiply it by the number of years or partial years you take to repay what you borrowed. Okay, let us go ahead and practice that formula now using three different descriptions: a cash loan, a big screen TV, and a college loan. So following our formula, in order to find interest, we need to multiply principal, or $100, times the interest rate, or 40%, times the amount of time it takes us to pay that back, a half a year. Let us go ahead and look at this first one before we practice on our own. So, we would take $100 times 0.4 times 0.5. You may be wondering why 0.4. Remember, we have to change the interest rate of 40% to a decimal number, so that would equal 0.4. We then have to take the amount of time, in this case half a year, and convert that to a decimal number. Since it is half a year, we would then use 0.5. We now see that in order to borrow $100, the amount of interest we would have to pay at this interest rate would be $20. So, the total amount to be repaid on a $100 principal loan would be $100 plus 20, or $120. Let us now go on and consider scenario number 2, the big screen TV. Go ahead and pause the podcast, perform your calculation, and then check your work later. Alright, let's go ahead and see if your math is correct. In order to find the interest on a $700 loan at 7% interest over 2 years, we would need to multiply $700 times 0.07 times 2. In other words, in order to borrow $700, we would need to pay back the full $700 plus $98 in interest, or $798 total. We got one more scenario for you. That is a college loan. Again, go ahead and pause the podcast, perform your calculations, and check your work later. Okay, let's see how we did. We have to multiply $12,000 times 0.035% times 15 years. The amount of interest you will pay on a $12,000 loan at this interest rate over this amount of years is $6,300. The total amount to be repaid is $12,000 original principal plus the $6,300 interest charge. So in the end, you will have to pay back $18,300. Let us now consider the same amount of principal borrowed with varying interest rates and varying times to pay back those loans. We're looking to see if there's a lesson here. Go ahead and pause the podcast, perform your calculations, and then let's check our work. In the first scenario, a $5,000 loan at 7% interest paid back over 2 years would cost us roughly $700 in interest, or $5,700 over the life of the loan. In the second scenario, with the principal of, again, $5,000, but a lower interest rate at 5.5%, paid off over a longer period of time, 3 years, we would be paying $825 over the life of the loan. But the total amount to be repaid would actually be $5,825. In the third scenario, we have $5,000 to be borrowed at still a lower interest rate, 4.75, over a longer period of time, now 4 years. In total interest, we'd be paying $950 for this particular loan at this particular interest rate over this length of time, or $5,950, as again, we have to pay back the principal plus the interest. So what do these calculations teach us as consumers? In order to answer that question, let us consider the principle in economics known as profit motive. Which of these scenarios is going to save you the most amount of money over time? The correct answer is the first scenario, where you have an interest rate of 7%, but a shorter amount of time to pay that off. In other words, in this scenario, you're paying less in interest and therefore less of a total amount to be repaid. We're almost to the end here. Here's a couple of other important terms to know as they relate to our borrowing unit. First of all, annual percentage rate. This is defined as the interest rate calculated in a consistent way, so it's easier to compare different borrowing options. Your lenders are now legally required to tell you this in writing before signing any agreement. Down payment is defined as the initial upfront portion of a total amount due, usually paid in cash when finalizing a transaction. In other words, this is what you, as a consumer, have to pay to your lender up front. We usually see down payments required for those big ticket items like cars and houses, not so much for your college loan. And then lastly, the balance. This is the total amount of money that a person or a consumer still owes their creditor. Let's consider whether or not some of these are good reasons to borrow money. Taking out a $5,000 student loan for college tuition, charging dinner and movie tickets during a night out with your friends, buying a laptop that's on sale using the store's financing program, getting a loan to pay your credit card bills, charging repairs to get your car running again, and borrowing cash from a friend to buy some magazines. Be sure to bring your responses into class, as we'll be talking about these in more detail. That takes care of our podcast on types of borrowing. If you guys have any questions, be sure to write those down, bring them in, and we'll get them answered. Until then, have a great day, guys.